welcome to Beating a Dead Horse, where we tell you who lived, who died, and who deserved to die. I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week, we watched Baby Driver. Baby Driver is the latest movie adaptation of a novel featuring a baby who is currently infiltrating the home of a family to understand why dogs are getting more love than children. This is an ongoing problem in this universe, and this movie seeks to explore and explain why dogs are quickly becoming favorable to the vomit-spewing miscreants that are babies. Jackson, I know that this was a highly anticipated movie for you, and I know that the book is really the crux of your whole education. You have a thesis coming out on it, and I know that this is the basis for your own novels. Tell me a little bit about how you felt about this movie adaptation. Was it honorable to the source material?
Well, I must say, speaking as not just a fan, but a scholar of the source material, I was very disappointed by The Boss Baby Driver. Too many side plots were omitted in this masterpiece of a novel, in the construction of this hack shill, popcorn spewing, capitalistic homunculus of a movie. But fortunately, that wasn't the only movie I saw this week. I also saw Baby Driver, an excellent film about a weird kid who listens to music while doing getaway crimes.
Yeah, I saw them both as well, and me personally, I loved Boss Baby, but I do think that Baby Driver was a little bit better. It had throes of Mad Max. It had a incredible heart to it in a lot of ways. There was the music and the visuals were all absolutely incredible. It did just a great job through and through, being an Edgar Wright movie. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. It's an Edgar Wright movie, and it was everything an Edgar Wright movie should be.
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of points I felt similarly about. The more I think about this movie, the more I kind of realize I had a bit of a surprisingly complicated reaction to it, in that I think it's great. It's a great movie. Easily one of the best I've seen all year. And I've seen some pretty strong movies this year. I think this has been a pretty good year for media in general. So I really loved it, and I think the Mad Max comparison is very apt. I was thinking about Mad Max a lot, both while I was watching the movie and afterwards kind of thinking about it, just because of how similar they are in terms of propulsiveness, how tight the script is, if not necessarily layered quite the same way, but in terms of just keeping you going, keeping the action intense, not really giving you much of a chance to let up. This movie has a bit more, with a few quieter side plots than Mad Max, which is kind of one big chase. And yeah, just, it was super stylish, super exciting. Baby Driver was a great movie, but the more I think about it, especially in relationship to Mad Max, there were not quite a few elements, but a couple elements that maybe on the script level felt a little underbaked. Nothing that stands out as really bad or terrible or something that maybe even doesn't work. And I don't know if I'd say there's anything in this movie that like just flat out doesn't work at all. But there were a couple of things that made me think that it's perhaps, in terms of like fast propulsive action movies, maybe a bit of a lesser film than Mad Max in terms of like the script and the layers, which is strange because I think the experience of watching this movie I enjoyed more than Mad Max, though, just because of how much more it fit into my tastes. I much prefer kind of the dirty, like, crime, like, modern-day aesthetic as opposed to the more sci-fi apocalypse feel that Mad Max has, kind of the total wasteland setting versus the city. So I don't know. I'm in kind of this weird place where I was thinking about it a lot, but even though I preferred watching Baby Driver, I maybe think that Mad Max was the stronger film.
I Loved. I'm not gonna argue with you on a single point that you made. I loved Baby Driver. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I will say that I did think that Mad Max was the more enjoyable movie to watch, and will probably hold up a little bit better, especially after we finish talking about this. It it worked really well on Baby Driver, that is, worked really well on a lot of levels and did a nice job of keeping the action moving. However, it didn't have the same kick, I guess, that Mad Max did for me. Like, I never stopped just like heart thumping, pulse pounding, edge of my seat loving Mad Max. This movie felt like there were a couple more moments that lulled, and it's a different movie in a lot of regards, where there are supposed to be movies or moments that lull, where they're talking or having a explaining something important to the plot, but it still, I part of it might have been that I was going into this hoping for a music driven Mad Max where there isn't that stop to it, but it didn't have the same grab to me that Mad Max did. I'm not saying, and once again, like, seriously, go see this movie. It's 100% fantastic and one of the best of the year. It just, in my book, still doesn't hold a candle to Fury Road, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. So I guess that's a hard candle to hold, but it needs to be held in this case. Wow, this candle analogy just got away from me.
I picked up on what you were saying, though. And yeah, I think that's an important point, and also maybe one of the reasons this movie appealed a bit more to my sensibilities than Mad Max did generally, just because I like having some of those slower moments where it slows down. And Mad Max Fury Road is a ridiculously tight movie. Like, I probably wouldn't change a thing about it. And I certainly wouldn't want it to slow down, but just as a viewer, that kind of relentless intensity, and I think it's pretty relentless in Mad Max. Like, that movie just never stops, never lets up on the gas. Haha, cars. But I think that personally, as a viewer, that is something that's a little bit just off-putting to me. Like, not something that I would say is bad, but just not my preferred mode of being engaged in a movie. Whereas I kind of liked that this movie had some of those moments, even if the content of those moments where it slowed down maybe created a few problems, and we can kind of get into that later. But the fact that it did take a little bit of time to slow down was something that I appreciated, while still giving that really exhilarating, like, adrenaline rush, propulsive feeling that ended up being very similar, but of course very different. Like, we're talking about these movies like they're identical, but it's only just like a general feeling. Like, there's really like a whole gulf of difference between them, but just that similar intensity, I guess, is what makes you unable to help from thinking of Fury Road, just because it's kind of the most recent example of that kind of movie, and one of the, like, best examples of that kind of movie.
Honestly, what might be a more apt comparison might be the Fast and the Furious movies, now that I'm upon review, just because they have more of the racing than talking, than racing than plot, than driving than plot. It's not as go, 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 plot while we're going, just keep going, go, go. So maybe comparing it to Mad Max isn't the way to go. Granted, comparing it to Fast and the Furious, though I genuinely enjoy these terrible, terrible movies, isn't really fair to Baby Driver either. It's kind of an anomaly because it fits in a lot of categories, but none neatly, just because it does a lot of things and pulls from a lot of sources, which both makes it a better movie and I think might also be what hurts it. It tries to do too much with what it has, and as a result, certain areas of it suffer.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about, because I've never seen any of the Fast and the Furious movies, so I mean, I'll take your word for it. They seem very similar in that they're both action movies where driving is a central component. And so that sort of wasn't my frame of reference, because I was also thinking just in terms of the way the dialogue scenes played out, and kind of the tone reminded me a lot of like a Tarantino movie. Maybe not quite the same in terms of like the style of the dialogue, because Tarantino's got such a particular way of doing dialogue, but just in general, kind of the exaggerated like criminal characters. The characters, that intensity is kind of just like baked into them, like from the conception. Like they're just really they're
driven characters.
Yeah. But in a way, like, not just in terms of like motivations, in terms of constructions, that they're very, I guess this isn't quite the proper word, but it kind of addresses another issue that I have heard kind of lobbed at this movie, and that they're very stylized. And one of the things I've seen brought up as a criticism of this movie is that it's very style over substance. And I kind of agree with that and kind of don't. It's strange. My feelings on this movie ended up being more complicated than I expected them to be, like I was saying.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, when I was first hearing that people were saying that it was style over substance, I was kind of immediately repulsed by that. But upon further review, I agree with them to some degree. I think there still is a lot of substance to this movie, but a lot of substance also gets kind of pushed to the side in favor of style.
Yeah, I think it can certainly be said that style is what not necessarily is driving this movie entirely. Not that there aren't any characters, not that there aren't any interesting things going on in that realm, because there are, I think, especially with Baby's kind of a weird character. He's got kind of a strange arc. Bat's really compelling performance by Jamie Foxx, really interesting character. Even if again he's kind of like hyperinflated in a way, it still makes it kind of interesting, and there's something there. But
hyperinflation doesn't make for a bad character.
Certainly not.
In certain movies, it is what makes the character. You expect hyperinflated characters in a movie like this. The problem comes from a certain character.
Yes, a certain character who is perhaps a little too underdeveloped, and maybe where the intent to have this stylized, cool movie that maybe called back to classic like action films, classic like driving films, where maybe those intentions and the desire to maybe do a little bit more with the script are coming a bit at odds. That's starting to get into spoilers, though, so do we want to kind of call it?
Yeah, let's jump into it. Call spoilers right here, and let's get talking. So let's kick it off by talking about the very first death we see, which we have a security guard killed by bats. And this is very kind of pivotal for the whole thing, because this is where, like, 5 minutes prior, Bats had just made a comment about how eventually you're going to have to deal with blood on your hands. Baby had routinely kept out of getting involved with the actual down and dirty of crime. He would only drive, as the title suggests. For this first death to kind of force him into this relationship with a character he might not have been expecting, to have this be a running theme starting with this, it's an important kickoff point, essentially. And I mean, even if you don't want to call this the kickoff point, 5 minutes prior, you'll have to deal with blood on your hands eventually is absolutely where it begins.
Yeah, that's definitely kind of the central question for Baby's character, and sort of the central, like, emotional push and pull of the movie, is that this relationship between Baby, not, I don't want to say a normal guy. He's not really a normal guy, but like a good person at heart, kind of roped into a bad situation, bouncing off of Bats, who is just like completely like unfettered, like completely unchained.
Does drugs to fuel his crime habit.
Yeah, precisely. And it's an interesting relationship. I think Bats is like Jamie Foxx's performance, like the way that character, the scenarios that the character finds himself in. I think by far one of the strongest points in the movie's, in the whole script, in the like the writing level of the movie, is just that relationship.
Is such an incredible foil in every regard to Baby, and Jamie Foxx does a wonderful job with him, just in his bloodlust and how he is much more crazy and unhinged as opposed to Baby's calm, cool, and collected head. They work really well opposite each other, and it really drives home each death in the movie. It's no long. Each one has a little bit of an extra pop to it, not only from this antithesis of each other as Baby witnesses yet another senseless killing that he clearly does not agree with, despite being complicit with, and the additional musical cues as it goes off really sells death in this movie, and it becomes an incredible overlying and underlying theme throughout the movie.
Yeah, and I think the timing of the deaths, like to the beat, like tying it into the music, I think really sells you like this bloodlust, the appeal of like this crime to someone crazy like Bats. It's exhilarating. Like, you're not mournful. I mean, you're shocked sometimes, like when like Bats like kills everyone in the room, like in that gunfight when they're getting the weapons from the boss's contact. But you're not really, it's not something that you very much feel in your gut when someone dies in this movie. You end up entering, it's strangely it in a weird way, like the deaths of like the mooks and the innocent civilians and the security guards and all these people end up being a weird blend of kind of these two characters' foils. Like, it ends up becoming like, with the music, like part of this like trance like state where you're not even really processing them as people anymore. And that's kind of like a mix of like the rhythm of like what Baby does, like that calm like feeling, plus with like just the like thrill of like the crazy crime like Bats lifestyle.
And that is actually really interesting too, because I hadn't looked at it in that perspective, is that every time we see Bat's perspective with the music on in the background, like that Tequila remix, it's very, I don't want to say hyped, but it's hyped.
Yeah.
It's pumping, and you're like just into it, and you're watching, and you're like, yeah, blam, blam, it's great timing, it sounds incredible, it's so cool. But every time Baby witnesses something like that, the music kind of gets slower and quieter and more subdued. It works, like the music just plays so well in this movie. Obviously it was designed around it.
Yeah.
And it handles it lovingly and really emphasizes the difference in these personalities and how they're treating each of these deaths. It's not until Baby eventually snaps and kills Bats that the music gets a little bit more high tempo and up and intense as he tries to escape and kills Bats and helps kill Darling and etc. etc. Those are when it gets exciting, is when he eventually embraces this murdering as a necessity.
Yeah, and it's strange because like the way Bats is approaching the world, he didn't just like murder as a necessity, it's drugs to fuel his crime habit, and like he delights in it. And it's sort of interesting how we are meant with Bats' death, like that's the one moment in the movie where like perhaps we're feeling his perspective the most. Like, cause that scene like still sticks out in my mind as like one of the as just like the climax of that arc, and just like the kind of the embrace of like the criminal lifestyle by Baby, that like by killing bats is the moment where like we are embracing his lifestyle, like we are pumping our fists at this like extremely brutal death, and it's not just a necessity, although it is, because like Bats is nuts and like he needs to be taken out, but like we are like pretty much, if not like literally like cheering, like in our minds, like pumping, like, oh yeah, like that was so fucking badass, like he got like skewered on that pole, and really like killing Bats is the moment where like he's, you know, it's the completion of the arc, the moment where he's just proven right, both on the level of like him talking to Baby and Baby as a character, and also for us as the audience, where we just completely embrace like everything going to hell, everything just gets pumped up in the intensity after that, less quiet moments, and we just fall completely into it.
It is the moment that Baby becomes Bats, albeit temporarily, but as he becomes Bats, the audience becomes from Baby's perspective to Bat's perspective, as you were saying, and we revel in it. We love it. I think it works on a different level because it is also the most visceral death in the movie. Like, it made me uncomfortable as I was watching it, which does allow for this death to present a certain cognitive dissonance between just going, fuck yeah, it's finally happening. We're finally going to get rid of this asshole who's been tormenting Baby the whole time. And, oh my God, there wasn't a better way to do that? That's awful. What are you doing? That's makes me uncomfortable just thinking about it. God, what's happening? It's a good 1-2 punch that you might not even really realize. It's a nice little scene of filmmaking. It does its job well.
It does its job very well. A great conclusion to the best like arc in the whole movie, in my opinion. I think it's interesting because it serves as a contrast to another death earlier in the film that kind of sparks the incident, more or less, with Baby finally wanting to get out, and because the death that like steals his resolve, so to speak. I mean, it was his last job either way, like he was gonna get out, but like the death that really like obviously like sinks home for him is when he has to dispose of JD, the one bodyguard who fucked up and I think left his gun with the fingerprints or something like that, and he left like a trail, so Bats and the boss, they had to like take him out, and Baby is left to dispose of the body. And it's interesting that like such a pivotal character moment is done on like the one death in the whole movie that was off screen. I think even Baby's mother, who died in like a flashback, gets a flashback where we're like, see the car crash, that is the source of like his hearing condition, and the thing that ended up killing her. It's the one off-screen death in the whole movie that,
and we don't even really get a body from it. Like, we get kind of a flash of the body, like, hey, it's here, it's actually him, just to confirm that it is who we think it is, but we barely even get that. It's a very quick shot of just, it's JD, go get rid of it.
And it's very interesting because it really brings up the question of how culpable in Baby really is in all this, because like he has to dispose of the body himself. I mean, he didn't kill him, but like he was part of that. He was part of the job that like led to him being killed, and like it's something.
He's definitely an accessory at that point.
Yeah. And it's
It's baby steps.
Yeah. Uh, so, and that moment's a little interesting, a little bit weird to me, just because of, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, that it's kind of uncomfortable because we're like seeing the remains get like crushed into this like, you know, steel cube in this car, like in the junkyard, but baby, it's presented as like a freeing moment, like he's done, like he's out finally, like that was the last job, and of course like it isn't, but I guess that's sort of the point, is that it isn't, and then he still has to keep doing it, and he can't really get out by just like, you know, just disposing of this body.
Yeah, I looked at it very in a similar light, but kind of differently, because I saw this as a half step before the whole step. This was he had him dispose of a body, making him officially an accomplice, though not the murderer. So, in return, he gets half of his freedom. At that point, he is no longer indebted to Doc, Kevin Spacey's character, but he is, as we later find out, still required to work for him under just threat of being killed. It's not until he ultimately commits to killing people that he is granted his full freedom. It is, as I said, baby steps in both murder and freedom. It's a halfway point at about the halfway point, but you don't really realize it then. It's just another death at the time.
That's interesting to me, just because I think that with Doc brings up a lot of other issues, and the fact that the way his death in the movie plays out the way it does was very strange to me, just because in a movie like this, Doc is the character who either doesn't die and is just kind of the mob boss that you can only escape from, or is the character that is like the final obstacle. And that's not what happens here. Killing Doc isn't what, you know, gets Baby out of the situation. He actually goes to Doc for help, and it's John Hamm's character, Buddy, that's kind of presenting this final obstacle for him. And I think the other thing that Doc brings up is that it's not really much freedom at all, because like, sure, he's no longer indebted to him, but like, you know, he knows about Deborah, he knows about his girlfriend, is like, you know, implicitly like, you know, nice girlfriend he got there, shame if something happened to her, and that kind of implicit threat really makes it, I think, just hammer home the scene as not so much a half step, but just like a complete, or maybe half measure is the more correct word I'm thinking of. It may be because, like, you know, no more half measures, like in Breaking Bad. The fact that Baby is still like following these orders, that he's still under this control, still has to like suffer under this threat, and the fact that he isn't taking action himself is sort of what's keeping him under control of like the mob or whatever, this gang.
Yeah, he's only doing what he's told, not committing to an action. And that's a shit, son, we just broke this thing wide open, because that is what Doc is constantly trying to get him to do. The whole idea of it is for him to take his own actions, and this half action, as he's only doing what he's told to do and he gets rewarded with half a measure of freedom, is because he didn't take the action unto himself. It's not until he does take his own actions that he is granted his own freedom. It's an element of liberation, essentially.
Yeah.
It is taking the steps to freeing yourself from what you need to be freed from. That was a terrible sentence.
No, I see what you're saying though, and I think that sort of also brings up the question, and that it's not just baby's freedom at stake anymore. And I think that's starting to get into the other big thing that I wanted to think about, kind of wanted to discuss, which was Deborah, and more specifically the way women are presented in this movie, the way the women are handled, because there's only 3 of them. One of them's dead before the movie starts. Or I guess 3 major characters. There's like the lady that like baby steals the car from. But like as far as major characters, there's only 3 women. There's baby's mom, who's dead before it starts. There's Darling, Buddy's lover, who gets killed to motivate him. And then there's Deborah, who of course is like by far like presented as baby's central motivation, despite their relationship being a little bit underwritten, I think. And it gets to the territory, and this is where I start to think that maybe the film isn't as much of like a well-oiled machine as Mad Max, just because it feels like this is the part of the movie, because it's funny when I think about like the style over substance, the accusations that maybe the script is being a little too simple. I think with like Bats' character and like the way like baby's personal decisions are working, and like baby's character himself, there's a good deal of complexity happening in a lot of those scenes, kind of playing with the way we indulge in action cinema, and like kind of entreating the audience to like think about how our like enjoyment of this spectacle is like feeding into like kind of these like philosophies of violence. And there's more going on with there, but like really I think the only places where you can accuse the film of being too simplistic is when it starts to introduce women to the story, because Deborah's character herself feels I don't remember. I definitely, in Red Letter Media's review, they were talking about this, that the film had a very old Hollywood feel, especially with regards to that romance, how it's kind of very simple. There's not much drama in there. They just kind of like go along with each other unquestioningly, despite knowing each other for like 2 weeks. The mom, again, there to motivate baby, there to like drive his interest in music, kind of not really presented as a character of her own.
Basically, this is the movie of how to fridge a woman. Just a quick editor's note. Fridging is the act of killing off a character, usually a woman, simply to further the plot or cause another character anguish, or to create some sort of motivation for a main character.
Yeah, and on that, in one sense, I'm glad that Deborah doesn't get straight up fridged. I'm not sure it matters that much, considering like the implicit threat of her getting fridged is what the character conflict hinges upon. And it doesn't get that many brownie points, because then kind of the shocking turn this movie makes, again, it sort of sets you up to think that like maybe Bats or maybe Kevin Spacey or like one of those characters that baby is coming into conflict with will be sort of the like final hurdle to overcome, but it doesn't ends up being John Hamm's character, who is motivated by the death of a woman, and I think that's a really interesting moment that like I think it's bucking your expectations of like where the movie's going to go in like a good way for John Hamm's character, but that doesn't really that doesn't really change the fact that, like, in order to get there, we had to just, like, make the women in this movie completely disposable.
Yeah, I mean, it is cool that they kind of trade around which character ends up with the motivation of a dead significant other. It would have been really cool and really different had Buddy been killed instead of Darling, just to kind of motivate a more female driven antagonist at the end. It is a very man centric movie, which, I mean, it is what it is, but it definitely would have been cool to see Darling going on a rampage instead of Buddy. But it is nice, though, that as opposed to seeing the hero's significant other get fridged, it was the villain's significant other that got fridged. Kind of a different take on it. It's just the fact that somebody still needed to get fridged is really the central problem.
Yeah, and I think what makes it particularly a problem is that the movie didn't necessarily need to go there with regards to Baby, just because it feels like we already have, from the opening scenes of, like, where we see Baby's life, we already have enough at stake with Joseph, like, you know, his kind of guardian figure, who's, you know, old and deaf and kind of vulnerable, but, like, definitely, like, a fleshed out character. So we kind of have that hanging over, I guess. The fact that we have this romance to kind of have that specter of, like, the hero's love interest getting killed to, like, try and, like, motivate him. The fact that we have that over us when we don't really need it, I think, is one of the things on a script level that kind of drags the film down a little bit for me, just because I don't know, it feels like there was a lot going on with Baby's kind of complicated relationships with these criminals, that having something arise from that more naturally.
So naturally, are we thinking something like he kills one of the people in the crew and causes a heist to go bad? Because, I mean, that feels like that could have been a good alternative to having somebody die for one of the characters or two of the characters to want revenge. I feel like had they done something like that towards the end, where maybe he kills Jamie Foxx's character as they're robbing a post office, it would have really just, it would have given John Hamm's character enough of a motivation to want to go and kill everyone he loves without having to unnecessarily kill Darling. I think that would have worked well. I feel like I just described the end of the movie, though, except Darling's still alive.
Yeah, like, while you were saying that, like, that you pretty much hit the nail on the head. Like, I remember while I was watching, like, you already feel that tension from when he kills Bats, that, like, oh shit, like, Buddy and Darling aren't gonna fucking, like, tolerate this foolishness. Like, they're gonna come after him, and then Darling dies, and it feels a little bit egregious. Like, there's
just not really a point. It felt out of character for her to go nuts there and try and kill all the cops. It felt like that scene just felt really out of place. Was it cool?
Yes.
Yeah. Was it warranted? That's debatable.
Yeah, so we get into that, and, like, it would have been, maybe could have set up even cooler action now that you have, like, two baddies coming after, like, a team coming after Baby instead of just John Hamm. And I think and again, like, I don't have the script in front of me. I have only watched the film, like, once. I'm not going to be able to give you, like, a full, like, dissection of, like, maybe what you could have done instead. But, like, I'm really questioning whether we needed that half-baked romance, the simplistic romance, to kind of motivate Baby with that threat of death. Since it's already so well presented as such, like, a dangerous world. He's already got, like, a father figure at stake, that I don't know if because it doesn't really have, like, you know, we kind of talk about the old Hollywood tone, but again, it really sticks out like a sore thumb. The rest of it feels pretty modern, pretty pretty heightened, not in that kind of classic, like, Americana, like, diner setting, that...
I think it was kind of supposed to be a contrast point. Like, because she is set in your Americana diner, which everything else is very modern. She does seem to lean into the 1950s style of everything. She invites him up for a cup of coffee, which is not really something that you hear outside of, like, joking. It all feels like her character is just playing a surrogate 1950s, and I think that's why it stands out so much. It just doesn't stand out in a good way. It's not a bad way, but I feel like we're missing the point he's trying to get across with that. I can see where they're kind of going with it, a longing for a simpler time, a time when he was with his mother back in the I suppose it's 1970s.
Yes.
I don't know. Which is, see, that's the other thing. That's really weird, is that his mother's in the 1970s, and they're clearly using Deborah as a pseudo representation for that simpler time with his mother, but they use a very 1950s styling of it down to the car and dress at the end that doesn't quite jive with what they're doing. I feel had they given her that 1970s, it would have driven the point home a little bit more, but maybe they were worried about it being too on the nose, so instead they did this, which just makes it feel like more of a sore thumb. The character is just kind of odd and out of place, and that's what it boils down to in my eyes. And I basically am agreeing with everything you're saying, and we could have written that whole part with Deborah out, and it wouldn't have changed the movie that much. I liked her in the movie. I liked what she did with it, but it also was kind of extraneous. As you were saying, there were other people that he could have focused on saving, like his father figure.
And that's sort of the other strange thing to me, is just that you're absolutely on point with the whole, like, contrast, like the longing for a simpler time, and like kind of the contrast between that being kind of his ideal, like what he wants to be in, versus that being, I guess that's what it's supposed to be, like the situation like he wants to be in versus the one that he is. Because like I'm just thinking that like otherwise I guess that stands out as very strange to me, just because his situation with Joseph, that's such a specific relationship. That's, you know, all the stuff with Deborah is being done very broadly, very, very much working with stereotypes. But, like, the other parts of his personal life are very specific and personal, you know?
Joseph is a fantastic character. They presented a character with disabilities, both deaf, in a wheelchair, and didn't let that slow him down or stop him. It was still a very, very good character with very good representation across the board. The problem is the contrast in giving Deborah the women in this movie are not treated with the same respect. His mom is fridged early on, which I can get behind if we need to kill his mom just to kind of set some things in motion. The problem is that then Darling is fridged, and his love interest is there pretty much just to be a love interest. They could have cut that part. They could have kept Darling alive and created a second antagonist towards the end, which would have been really interesting. They could have created more women in the heist. That I feel like that would have been a better representation as a whole. It just, the death of women in this movie largely felt meaningless. The ones who did live were kind of unnecessary and felt underwritten and underrepresented, which is the sad part.
Yeah, and I think you really hit the nail on the head, and that I think just the decision to kind of make it that dreamy old Hollywood style was just ill-advised, because you could very easily, like, I agree, like, Joseph is wonderful. Like, you get one scene with that man, and you can feel their relationship, and you totally buy into it, and because a lot they give like a lot of specific details. You just understand like immediately. So like it wouldn't have been that hard to make that kind of like specific relationship between her and Baby, and that would help. I mean, yeah, you'd still have you wouldn't be able to get around the fact that like, yes, the threat of her being Fridge is what's being driving Baby and like motivating him, but if she's more of a character and like if that ending sequence is more if Darling is still alive and that ending sequence is like them coming after the two of them, and it's like 2 and 2, and they both have to like think on their feet, that could create interesting opportunities for like action scenes, and B, just feel more maybe feel a little more thematically on point, like the contrast between like this couple that wants to live like a normal quiet life versus the ones who like revel in like this life of crime, as opposed. So then the point in that, so then yes, like the threat of Deborah being killed is still what's motivating Baby, but the fact that she's more of a character and is maybe giving more to do, like I'm glad that she didn't just like sit around for the entire finale and like she at least clubbed John Hamm with the crowbar.
Yeah, she definitely did come into her own at the end a little bit. Like, it wasn't great, but we should say that she did take some action.
We needed more. I'm not gonna say more of that, but more specific character action. And there were opportunities to do it too, like scenes. There's plenty of diner scenes where like the worlds are starting to like bleed over, and like it's kind of all on Baby there. We don't really see her do much. But yeah, I don't know. I think again, like that's sort of where this movie versus Mad Max, and that, you know, Mad Max is like the way that movie treats its women. You know, Furiosa is like pretty much like the central protagonist.
She is the main character in everything but title.
Yeah, precisely. And I think just that's a good movie for like, you know, you can say that we're focusing too much on this, and I think Mad Max is a good example for like how, when you give your women in your movie like the time and respect to like be characters, that opens up opportunities to do more exciting things, so it isn't just feeling like an underwritten sore spot.
Even the captives in that movie come in Fury Road, that is, come into their own and have moments and character development and like action sequences, and they're people that you wouldn't expect to do anything. They are the quintessential damsels in distress, but they are treated with respect and grow and change throughout the movie. They are basically what Deborah should have been. She isn't quite a Deborah in distress, a damsel in distress, but she is. I don't know how to put it. She deserves to be treated with the respect that those women did as side characters.
It's a good comparison, and I like that you brought up Immortan Joe's wives, the captives in particular, because they all do kind of have personalities and defining moments, and they are still given, despite their situation, they're given a certain amount of agency that Deborah isn't really until the end, and when she does, it's really questionable. Like I found just because she was so underwritten, like I found myself going like, what? Like when she like just agrees to like run away with Baby after like a week for knowing him. Like I can buy a plot beat like that, but not if we're only seeing this relationship in such broad strokes.
It was a weird moment. The end, I do feel, despite very much enjoying the style of the end, I do feel it fell apart in a lot of ways.
As far as the ending goes, it felt kind of weird to me, and I think one of the big the reasons I got hung up on Deborah so much was that's kind of where we end, with the achievement of this idealized like 50s world, when really it was working for me when they were kind of running away, and you know, Baby decides to kind of like cut off his cycle of being involved in this world of crime, of having to kill to get out, and then being presented with a choice to kill the cops to get away, and Deborah's ready to another decent moment for her. She's ready to help and gun it, even if that moment isn't quite earned. But then Baby is no, I can't get you involved in this. No one should have to go through what I did, being dragged in by someone else, and he chooses to turn himself in. Good. But then what's weird to me is that we come back to the idealization of it. We don't really get much consequence, despite, yes, Baby's he's our hero, we root for him, we like him, and he's good at heart, but that doesn't really excuse the fact that not just in disposing of the body, he's been an accessory to murder all along. He's been complicit in all these crimes, and the fact it felt when I walked out of the theater and saw him get his old Hollywood happy ending, driving into the sunset, that it felt like he got off too easy and maybe undid a little bit of that great work that was being done with him and Bats and Kevin Spacey earlier.
Yeah, I do agree, and I kind of left feeling very similarly. When she sent him postcards and everything, it felt weird. Nothing about their relationship felt like it should have lasted the 5 years that he was in prison. It felt... the relationship in this movie is so strange because I'm pretty sure the entire movie takes place over the span of less than a week up until the end, where it jumps 5 years.
Yeah.
And Deborah stays and agrees with everything the entire time. And it's easily the most off-putting part of this movie for me. Just because there were moments where I just went, wait, why? What prompted this? Why is she agreeing to that? Who in their right mind would? And yeah, there is a level of you have to set aside suspension of disbelief. But there's only so much disbelief I can set aside when the person who's known you for a week goes to prison and you wait for 5 years.
Yeah, this is maybe a case where, to make that kind of character, to make that kind of feeling work, maybe it had to be more style over substance than it actually is. That's the sort of thing, I'm trying to think of a comparison, but I'm actually struggling just because, yeah, it's so excessive that, we get...
Actually, here's a good comparison. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. That movie, basically, no one in it really ever develops that much character. But you feel for all of them, and in the end, you are happy that Ramona and Scott got together. Because it was so beautifully stylized and enjoyable that it became believable through that.
Yeah, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World also had the benefit of working with great source material. I will advocate for those comics until the end of time. And I'm trying to think of an instance, though, where... because that movie was also... Yes, it was a stylized action movie, but it was also centrally about that relationship. That was its goal, was getting together with Ramona, and it kind of deals with relationship issues in its own, kind of kooky way.
See, I would argue that this weird relationship between Deborah and Baby is almost the central point as well. It's, if not the central, it's very tangential to it. It is running alongside it the entire time, and I know it's parallel, not tangential at that point, but there's so much of a focus on it that it's hard to say it's not a big part of it.
Oh, it's definitely a big part of it, but my thinking was less Scott Pilgrim and more like a Hitchcock film, more like North by Northwest, or a movie like that, where we get kind of this, and those are spy thrillers and not gangsters, but it's, a similar sort of chase movie. And in the end, despite only knowing each other for like the course of this adventure, which is like a week, a couple days, 2 weeks at most, the male lead and the female lead like care about each other and like go off into the sunset at the end. But I guess the difference is in North by Northwest, the female lead isn't waiting, for Cary Grant to get out of prison after 5 years. It's just really, that little detail is super excessive, I think.
It's a weird one.
The scene before it with like with the trial and everyone like vouching for Baby's like golden spirit, basically, is also kind of strange to me, because like, sure, I'll buy that, like, obviously, like, Joseph is gonna, stick up for the kid. Obviously, Deborah's gonna stick up for him in court, like, trying to add those. But, like, then you see this...
He gave me my purse. He also stole my fucking car.
Yeah,
but he gave me my purse.
Exactly, and it just really undercuts not just what he was complicit in, but, like, what he actually did. And just, like, the implication that, like, Baby fucked up a lot of shit. Like, he's responsible for a lot of people dying, and and the movie just kind of brushes it off, and that's strange to me, considering the whole arc with Bats was so well realized earlier in the movie.
And it is kind of him coming to grips with his actions have consequences, and that is what Kevin Spacey has, as I said, fought for him to realize, that he can take his own actions, and those actions will have consequences. Yeah,
so, but then the consequences are wiped away, more or less. 5 years, his cute waitress girlfriend is still waiting for him. That'll ever happen. And that's the sort of thing that maybe you could buy, if she was more of a character, but I still think that doesn't get rid of the other underlying weirdness for me. That was just that this film maybe wants to paint Baby as being more like pure of heart than he actually is. And not that Baby's a bad guy, like, certainly no. Like, it's not like he chose this life.
I mean, he kind of did. He was taken because he was stealing cars.
I was actually just about to correct myself. You're absolutely right. So, like, yeah, the fact that the movie wants... It feels like Kevin Spacey wants Baby to, like, own up to his consequences, but the movie doesn't, at least in that last scene, because that feels like... And sure, maybe it's the obvious choice that, like, given the choice, like, keep running or, like, turn himself in, like, yeah, Baby turns himself in, but, like, sure, you could say that's obvious, but, like, that's what the movie was building up towards. Or you'd go the opposite way, or, Baby cruises on through the guards and, like, kind of just runs free and rejects the consequences and, like, is fully immersed in the lifestyle now. Like, him and Deborah become, like, the new, like, buddy and darling, and that could have been an interesting ending too. That could have worked.
That's where that was going, and I was really on board with it.
Yeah, I think either way could have worked if they had played it properly, but just the way it is now, it felt like
another half measure.
It felt like another half measure, and especially, like, it's where the old Hollywood, that old Hollywood thing is coming back. Like, they wanted the old Hollywood ending, but, like, just had to jump through hoops to get there, and it just rings a little hollow.
The old Hollywood part is the worst part of the movie, and to end on that just really sours it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And speaking of ending, we would like to thank Lords of the Highway for the use of their song Suicide Alternative Take. It's off the album High Octane, Low Expectations. I'm Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda. I'm also streaming on Twitch every Wednesday from 8 to 10 at Helpless_Skippy.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter at Jackson J. Keller, and that's pretty much the only place I hang out on the internet.
And remember,
He's a good kid and devil behind the wheel. What the hell else more do you need to know?
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go